Good evening and welcome to the Thursday lectures, a cooperation of the Research Institute Materiality in Art and Culture and the Conservation Restoration Program of the University of the Arts in Bern. In the frame of the Thursday lectures, we try to open a window to research, especially for our students, but we decided to open this format to public as well. My name is Sebastian Dobruskin. I am the head of the Institute. But in the future, my dear colleague and deputy, Carmen Effner, will take over the task of organizing and hosting these events. But now, I give over to Hanne Hölling and Emily Magna, who prepared this event, and I wish you an interesting evening.
Thanks very much, Sebastian. Thank you so much for this brief introduction. I will now just pull up my notes and hope Emily is on the top of things for pinning people on the screen. So thank you very much, Sebastian. Good afternoon from Zurich and Bern. Good early morning and good evening, everyone joining us from their offices and homes today. I would like to welcome you all, our panelists, most of all, right, our attendees and my colleagues on this very warm spring day. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Hanne Hölling, and I am research professor here at Bern University of the Arts and associate professor in the Department of History of Art, University College London. It is my great pleasure to introduce the next in our series of events, a panel titled Conserving Us, Caring for Living Heritage, Oral Tradition, and Indigenous Knowledge, a conversation with Brandy Macdonald. I am greeting everyone also on behalf of my colleagues and co-members of our research team, Emily Magna, who will be speaking to you shortly, Jules Belter-Feldman, and Valerian Mali. The team of the project and of this panel came together due to a generous funding from the Swiss National Science Foundation and was made possible due to the continuing support of the Research Division and the Department of Materiality in Art and Culture at Bern University of the Arts. As you heard already from Sebastian, this event is taking part within the series Donnerstag Vortrag and is supported by the HKB Department of Materiality in Art and Culture headed by Sebastian. So I'd like just to say a few words about the project before we begin. Performance, conservation, materiality knowledge applies the theoretical practical apparatus of conservation to examine performance and performance-based works as a part of our culture and as forms changing and enduring in a network of people and things. In this project, we have switched the lens on performance from the established debates in performance studies, art history, heritage studies, and anthropology to the lens of conservation. And we started to consider and debate performance as a necessarily conservable form. We situate conservation as a disciplinary formation whose knowledge and practices not only grant us an unprecedented access to the knowledge about, in, or of performance, but they also provide a valuable contribution to other humanities disciplines, expanding knowledge about performance and obviously also about conservation itself. Today's event fits perfectly within the larger context of our project in that it asks, what can we learn from the processes of conservation and acts of care that take place in the communities that originate performance and other performance-related objects? What does it mean to conserve oral tradition or spiritual performance? What does it take to care for living heritage and indigenous knowledge? And how to approach these issues from the perspective of an institution through a decolonialized lens. We couldn't be more fortunate to gain Brandy Macdonald, the Senior Director of Decolonizing Initiatives, Chickasaw Nation, Choctaw Nation at San Diego Museum of Arts to help us shed light on these questions. So during this panel, we'll discuss how Indigenous performance might be preserved in and beyond institutions, what decolonialization might mean in an institution concerned with Indigenous cultures, and what does intellectual property mean in this context, for instance, and also how museums can become a space for engaging with cultures and with living rather than dead objects. And before I will give the mic to Emily, who will introduce Brandy in depth, I would like just to make a few remarks, a few housekeeping remarks. So the event has been conceived as a presentation by Brandy, which will be followed by a conversation led by Emily and myself. And later we will open the conversation to the public. There will be also a possibility to ask questions during this public part of the Q&A, either in the chat or directly. This is a meeting, a Zoom meeting, so you might also actually turn on your mic or also turn on your camera and ask the question directly during the Q&A. Sorry. I also remind everyone that the panel is being recorded and will be made available online at a later point. Yeah, now I wish us a wonderful event and give the mic to Emily.
Thanks, Hannah, and welcome everyone. I see that we are already so many, which is great. It is my greatest pleasure to introduce our guest, Brandie Macdonald. Brandy Macdonald is a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation and has ancestral ties to the Choctaw Nation. She holds a Master of Education in International Higher Education and a BA in Applied Anthropology. She is currently the Senior Director of Decolonizing Initiatives at the Museum of Us, located on the Choctaw Nation territory in San Diego, California. Brandie's work focuses on bringing systemic change in museums through the implementation of anti-colonial and decolonial theory in practice, which promotes truth-telling, accountability, and tangible change to redress the colonial harm. Besides her work at the museum, Brandie is also an active freelance consultant and a writer, working to support decolonial change in nonprofit museums, education, and botanical gardens. She is also enrolled in a PhD program for education studies at the University of California, and her research focuses on the sustainable application of decolonizing praxis in museums that enables transformative change and cross-cultural decolonial movement building. And I also wanted to add that I already have had the pleasure to talk with Brandie during an interview that I conducted within the frame of our FNS research project. So together we discussed many aspects of the preservation of living heritage and Indigenous heritage. And also we thought a lot about what it means to decolonize conservation practices. So this conversation was so rich and so inspiring that when I shared it with my research group, we decided that we should absolutely invite her to continue this in public here at the Institute for Materiality in Art and Culture. So Brandie, again, thank you so much for being with us. And the screen is yours.
Thank you. Halito Chokma Sanofa Brandie Macdonald Chickasaw Chapter. Hello, Brandy Macdonald. Thank you all for introducing me so much and for having me in this space. I'm honored to be able to share the work and to be in community with so many in this Zoom space. I'm a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation with ancestral ties to the Choctaw Nation, both located in the U.S. Imperial Colonial borders. I'm currently the Senior Director of Decolonizing Initiatives in San Diego, California, and the museum resides on the ancestral homeland of the Choctaw Nation, where I'm also located at the moment. I'm going to show you a bit of the presentation, and then as we go into the conversation, please feel welcome to ask me questions in terms of tangible examples or to explain further. The presentation is going to look at the museum that I work at, the Museum of Us, formerly the Museum of Man. We'll look at a decolonial framework that we use within our space, and then I'll kind of lean into some tangible examples of how this framework manifests inside of the museum, both looking at performance art historically, but also looking at some of the exhibit installations and some of our practices around consultation and our policies for repatriation and restitution. So with that, I'm going to start to share screen, and you can see our building. So this is the Museum of Us, formerly the Museum of Man. We changed our name to the Museum of Us in July 2020. So our building is a historic building. It was built in 1915. It's one of the oldest buildings in Balboa Park where this is located. It was always meant to be a museum of anthropology. Many folks think that it looks like a church. It does. It looks like a Spanish colonial church, but was never meant to be a church. As you can see, there is a lot of different images etched into the skin. There are 9 colonizers etched into the skin of the facade, from the very top all the way down to flanking the doors. The museum was birthed from the colonial endeavor. It was founded through colonial anthropological spaces. Its exhibits displayed people and humans talking about social stratification, the separation, the evolution of man, and talking about how different racial and ethnic demographics were at a lower socioeconomic hierarchy versus the Euro-white paradigm and racial category. We also see the ways in which the building celebrates the colonizers and legitimizes their place within this park that was built and displaced Indigenous populations. Oops. Just a second. There we go. The Kumeyaay peoples are the Indigenous populations of the land that we reside on, and they were the population that were displaced. They currently still live in the San Diego area and beyond. They are still stewarding the land, and we are actively working to redress the harm that we have caused. This is our building. It's a large square, and exhibits are all around the space. We also have ancestors on our site that we currently steward, and cultural resources that we currently steward. This is the footprint of our museum. Just to get the understanding of the vastness of our museum, we have 75,000 ethnographic objects from all over the world. I think the only country we don't have a representative from is, I believe it's Iceland or Norway, which I think shows the examples of the collecting practices of this anthropology museum over the 100+ years that we've been in existence. We also have over 7,500 ancestral human remains that are currently on site. We are actively repatriating ancestors back home, back to their communities. And because of the curating practices and tracking practices within archives and the people who've worked before us, we are also actively finding ancestors within our cultural resources collections holdings. Of the ancestors and the objects, very similar. They range from a variety of different communities all over the world. And so we've developed policies through our decolonizing practices to recognize this colonial harm on an international level. Keep stinging. Sorry about that, y'all. So before I go into our framework, I wanted to lay some foundation of at least how the definitions that we operate in when we think about decolonizing practices. So many times what we have found is a lot of folks apply decolonization to indigenization. Indigenization is part of decolonization, but for us and the work that I do within my research in the field, it's only part of it. You can't do decolonization without working around and integrating Indigenous people and thinking about indigenization, but it doesn't stop there. It really is looking at this very nonlinear, long process. How does it redress the colonial harm that you have caused? Looking about divesting from the colonial culture. Like, what does it look like in terms of how we are consistently, intentionally and unintentionally perpetuating white supremacy within our practices, within these concepts of whiteness, within these concepts of best practices. And then also thinking about how do we disrupt that relentless march of these best practices, right? Like, who is the authority? And who are we privileging within these spaces of authority for so long, and who are we erasing? One of the things I want to note before I go into the framework is, at least the way that we operate, decolonization is not turning back time. We're not jumping in a time machine and trying to go back to this concept, this utopian concept of how perfect it was. That's not what we're doing. We're really thinking about decolonizing as a verb. It is a practice in order to not continue to perpetuate harm, to continue to work towards creating inclusive spaces, equitable spaces, decolonial spaces that are thinking about how do we build a better future where we're not continuing to perpetuate harm, and we're also redressing the harm that we've done. There we go. So this is the framework that we work in. So we have guiding principles that really focus on our work leading forward. We really wanted to make sure that this practice was a systemic change and not necessarily something that just the Cultural Resources Department does or just the Education Department does. So my department and my position really came up with thinking about how do we make sure that we're creating a framework that everybody can operate in, that human resources is just as big a perpetrator of colonial harm as collections departments are. And so these are the guiding principles that our entire organization operates in. And so you're going to see some manifestations of these, specifically really looking at truth-telling, accountability, thinking about the concepts of ownership. What does it look like in terms of that intellectual property, the ownership of cultural heritage, and reciprocity? We're not just sitting here asking people to consistently give, we also need to give. Pathways go both ways. So when I talked about it earlier in terms of thinking about it's a systemic change, we really want it to be sustainable. Some of the things that we've seen in our past and that we've seen in the field's past is that many times there'll be these bits and pieces that are practices of decolonial thought, decolonial lens being applied, like in an education program or a public program or in an exhibit. But the inside is still rotten, right? Like the foundation of the organization is still colonial. And that was what it was with us. We had a deep colonial rot, deeply embedded within our collections, deeply embedded within our system. So what we looked at was how do we create a systemic change? And so we needed to make sure that we were having policy and practice moving symbiotically. And so you'll see some policies and practices on the next slide. I'm not going to go into all of this. I know this is a really heavy slide, but I wanted to show you the vastness of this work. I've been in this position for about 4 years, and this is where we've really leaned into, from changing our human remains policy. I'll show you a colonial pathways policy, but even thinking about formal apologies, what is our practice? That these are not just policies that live on the shared drive and die when I go and decide to have a falcon farm somewhere, but this is really thinking about practice. So we're changing the organizational culture, because we can also change the culture, but if there's not the structure to back up that culture, when we cycle out, the next people coming in don't have that structure in order to hold them accountable. So we wanted to think about what that is in terms of just changing the field in general. Museums are mountains. We move slow, and yet it is possible because this has been happening over the course of 7-8 years. And a lot of this has happened over the course of 4 years, which is pretty phenomenal for museums if you think about it. So I wanted to show a little bit in terms of, we talked about conserving us, we talked about cultural resources, we talked about Indigenous cultural heritage. These are some examples of our cultural resources / collection stewardship practices. So when I say cultural resources, that is what our collections department is named. We changed, we recognize that words have a lot of power. And so we switched a lot of our wording within our organization to honor the Indigenous knowledge, to honor the fact that these are cultural resources. They're not just items that people collect. They're not inanimate objects. So our departments are called Cultural Resources Department. The space that the cultural resources are held are called storage areas, where the cultural resources live and are stewarded until they either can go home or we have consent for them to be on display. The same thing with, instead of saying specimens or artifacts or items, they're ancestors, there's ancestral human remains, they're items, they're Indigenous belongings. So really trying to be conscious about the way that even our words can perpetuate harm. So if you see in these boxes, these are some examples of how our work manifests in our stewardship practices, in our archival, the ways that we look at conserving different pieces. Minimal disturbance is really important for us. It recognizes that there is a life for a lot of Indigenous peoples. There is a life in everything, even in this coffee cup, right? This coffee cup, for example, of cultural resource is connected to everything. It's connected to the past, present, and future of the community. And so we want to recognize that the Indigenous populations have told us that every time we move this cup, it's important for us to move it with intentionality because we don't want to lose it or forget where we stuck it, because that would be bad. But also we want to move it minimally so we don't disturb everything that it holds and the community that it's connected to, because this cup right now is holding a whole bunch, or let's see, water. Every time we move this glass of water, you see it disturbs the water inside of it, right? So we're really trying to think intentional. If a community tells us that's not their practice, then we change our practices and do the protocols that the Indigenous peoples have asked us in terms of storage, in terms of handling. But we usually default to minimal disturbance because we want to be as cautious as possible. We also want to make sure that consent is really important. And so thinking about making sure that if we're working with the tangible and the intangible, that we have consent about recording it, consent about tracking it, even consent to be in the room. We also work with access policies quite a bit with communities in terms of working with, right now we've just finished working with the Kumeyaay community, our ancestral homeland community, and creating an access policy that is them defining who has access to their cultural resources. We also have a blanketed access policy that we built up where researchers are not privileged, but the community the cultural resources came from. Right now we're working with the Maya communities around access policies around their cultural resources that are in diaspora. So an example of how some of these access policies come into play, especially with performance, right, and artists. So this is James Luna. James Luna is this amazing Indigenous artist. This happened, his artifact piece happened in 1984. This was in the Museum of Man. It was in the Museum of Us, which is wild because we were this mass colonial space that was actively displaying ancestral human remains from all over the world. We had ancestors on display from Peru, from Egypt, from the United States. And James Luna, an Indigenous artist, connected with a public programs team and asked to do a performance piece. He put his body on display in an act of protest around what does it look like to have humans, your aunties, your uncles, a live human being, and also dead human beings on display. He laid there for hours. And we have some images. We also have different documentation that's in our archival history and in other archival pieces of history in other institutions. People would come up and thought that he was dead and thought that he was actually a specimen, an artifact, and then he would kind of move or he would jump or he would wave at them and spook them. And then it would spark a conversation around what does it look like to have Indigenous ancestors? Why is it okay to have Indigenous ancestors on display? What does that look like for your auntie and uncle? This is really important when we think about a lot of our, how do we track this? And so previously this was in archives, everyone had access to it except for Indigenous people, but a lot of the researchers have access. What we've done recently because of our access policies is we've looked and worked collectively with James Luna's family. And they have asked in terms of what does it look like for them to make sure that they are tracking who is researching, what is the messaging going out. So it's not just the museum's message and how they define this work. So when people approach us and ask us for the archival information on this performance and how we've tracked it, for all of the images, for the recordings, we direct them to the family. And then the family has a specific organization that they work with that then they process through the research. So it's really important for us to set back and humble ourselves as an institution, as museum professionals, that we are not the experts. We are not the owners of any of this cultural heritage, ancestral knowledge, this performance. That is the family and their linkage to James Luna, and also just their connection, it's their heritage. And so when we have researchers, we direct them to that community. And if they say yes, they come back to us, and then we then distribute what we have based upon our agreement with the family. And then we have similar agreements with other Indigenous communities as well. James Luna, it was a catalyst for a lot of the different conversations that have happened around our repatriation practices throughout the field as well, because he's ended up taking that same performance and going into other museums and doing similar performance. And so this is a policy that's really important when we think about repatriation. We think about putting bodies on display, objects on display. Just recently, we talked about what does it look like in terms of returning all of our cultural resources. And so we came together to collectively working with Indigenous communities to recognize communities want their items back. So we looked at our history and our harm, and this is how we can redress harm. Is anything in our cultural resources holding that came to us through a colonial pathway needs to go home if the community wants it home. So a lot of folks ask, what is a colonial pathway? This is how we define a colonial pathway, and all of these are examples of the harm that we've perpetrated through our collecting history over 100 years. One of the most important pieces, I think, is to recognize pathways go both ways. And so this last piece here is maintaining ownership when cultural revitalization is dependent. So even if we didn't steal it, or we didn't create a power dynamics where we were taking advantage of communities, if the community wants it home, it should go home, because we shouldn't own their cultural heritage. We shouldn't own their cultural knowledge. An example of how we've also changed some of our cultural resource practices and our curatorial practices is through some of our Indigenous stewardships and our consultations. So this is an example of Ambassador Ole Sanchale. He came into our space wanting to talk about administrative practices, but we had cultural resources from his community. During our conversation with him, he pointed out some of the different cultural resources, talked about some of the different songs that connected with him. During that time, we're asking consent. Can we log this? May we record this so that the song can be connected to this cultural resources and they can live together? We also asked him, how should we care for cultural resources? We also asked him if he wanted them back. A lot of them, he's like, no, we don't want these cultural resources back. He's like, but if you're going to take these cultural resources and hold them, maybe you should care for them. And we're like, what do you mean? We are caring for them. And our director of cultural resources is like, let me name all of the chemicals that we're using. And he's like, those chemicals are killing our cultural resources. He was like, do you see this piece right here, which is an orum gimpe. It's a very long sphere, 17.5 feet. And he's showing us how it's used. He's talking about it. And he's also saying it is dying in your care. There's rust all over it. It's starting to crack. As you see, there's rust right here. He was like, you need to care for it in this specific way. You need to go and take animal fat and clean it a certain amount of times throughout the year. And it's going to come back to life. In a traditional museum setting, typically, at least in our museum, and a lot of times in collection practices, you wouldn't dream of putting animal fat on something, right? Because that's the chemicals. We have critters. We have an 100-plus-year-old building. There are animals everywhere, moths everywhere, all sorts of like snakes that come inside. But our collections practices, our cultural resources practices, even our colonial pathways policy says very clear that the Indigenous are the authorities on how to care for, steward their cultural resources, the ways in which that their archives, their voices are logged, are archived within the space, how they are stored, the way that they're going to be cared. So that's what we did. We went to a butcher, we got animal fat. And she tells this beautiful story about how as she's cleaning it, she felt it take a deep breath and be connected to its family, its community, connected to her again. And it's shiny now. And so just really thinking about how we can practice that in all of our work, and recognizing that even the physical material culture is connected to the larger scope of the people when we think about the intangible culture as well. These are some signs that we have in the space, and I'm going to scoot through these a little bit, but it's really important for us around transparency. Decolonizing initiatives, and I know it's small, I'll show you a close-up, but decolonizing initiatives in action is we want to be transparent with folks about what's going on behind the scenes, right? We have these very archaic pieces of exhibits that were made by like Euro-American, non-Maya researchers that talks about Maya peoples as peoples of the past. And so it's really important for us to be honest about that colonialism and also honest about where we're coming from. So you'll see these 3 spaces within our signage. It says Maya people are still here, right? They're thriving, and that this exhibit doesn't say that in its current manifestation. And so we want to make sure that we're doing better and telling folks, because museums have mad power, y'all. Like, we have so much power and trust within society. People come to us because we are the knowledge holders. We're supposed to be the experts, right? And so what does that look like when you have a piece and an exhibit around Indigenous people that paints them as a people of the past, and also is not from the narrative that Maya peoples wants to have their voices, the ways in which they want to be seen. And so we want to be really clear about that. So when people are coming in, that this is in transition, that we recognize this is outdated, that Maya peoples are still present. We also want to make sure that folks know who is funding it. So we're transparent about the money coming in the door and that partnership and relationship. And then what is our commitment to our consultants? These actions are the same actions that are in our letters of agreement. They're the same actions that we say when we ask them to participate. So this is really important, that we're also showing community what we have committed to, so that we're also holding ourselves accountable to the larger public, not just the consultants. I'm going to show you a couple of slides. The transition, you saw how it was really brown, right, and kind of dark, and then we have the transition here where it started to kind of lighten up. This was phase 1. We did consultation with some of the consultants around what could be on display, what are the cultural resources on display. We did deinstall, and when we did deinstall, the consultants came in and they played ocarinas for the first time in like 70, 80 years that these cultural resources have been touched by their ancestors. They also use some of the offering bowls. And so really recognizing that these items, it's important for them to connect to their ancestors, that they should touch them, they should feel them. We do let them know that there may be chemicals on them, but they can decide because they're their resources. We also provide gloves if they want. But if they want to play the ocarina, then they can play the ocarina, because that performance, that action is essential. In terms of us tracking that, we ask if we can write that down in our archives. We ask if we can record it. If they say no, then we don't do it. Because it's their cultural heritage and it's their moment. It's not about us, because even in that space, it's not about talking about it and saving it for eternity. It's really about that connection to the people and their cultural heritage and that diaspora that museums and colonialism has created. So from that space, just really quick, we then worked with a Maya Cantonese and are still working with a Maya Cantonese artist. And so we are going to put and are putting a 17.5-foot and 12-foot mural that is a community-led mural, a Maya community-led mural, and then a 12, well, it's 12 feet wide, but we realized that the 12 up here is actually 11.6 because the lintel was a surprise. We didn't even know it was there, and it showed up, which is, I think, also phenomenal because it was hidden, I think, in the 50s, and then we didn't have any archival information about it. So here is the artist, Alicia Siu, and this is the work she projects on the wall. Why I show this is that it's really important for us to talk a little bit about what it looks like in terms of her cultural knowledge, her intellectual property, the tangible and intangible that all goes into this. These are all stories of Maya peoples. This is her cultural heritage. And so when we're working with this artist with this project, we have changed our contract to where, yeah, we're giving her an honorarium. We're also paying per diem because she's working very long hours. But in that contract, we're saying we're paying for the time and that she owns all of the intellectual copyrights, all of the property rights, that this is the Maya cultural heritage and that the museum does not own this piece. It is not an accessioned piece, but it is a piece inside of the exhibit. So any of the production pieces, like that we're gonna sell on the gift shop or that goes on marketing, needs to go through her first. She maintains control of this cultural heritage. Additionally, we're recognizing that if this ever needs to come down, it's in the contract that she also needs to be contacted, or if it's repaired, needs to be contacted. And so within a certain amount of years. We really wanted to shift to make sure that the museum is not this position of power, that we're sharing power, that we're ceding power, because this is their cultural heritage, this is their exhibit. And how do we work collectively together to make sure that we honor that Indigenous knowledge that she has gifted this colonial building and the community, and that the community itself has gifted, the Maya community has gifted the space. The other thing I want to show you is just the interactive performance that then leads to installation. Hostile Terrain 94 talks about the migrants' lives that have been lost at the Arizona border. Each one of these tags are representative of human life lost. They are attached with a screw onto the wall, and it is geolocated to where their bodies were found at the border, at the Arizona, US-Mexico border. The bright neon ones are unidentified people. It gives their longitude and latitude, their geolocation. It sometimes has a QR code that you can scan, and then you can hear the voice of their families, especially on the Manila ones, because we know who they are. So the orange ones, unidentified, we don't know their identity. But the Manila ones, we have their first, last name, how their body conditions, where they were found, their connection to their family. This is the graph. So what we did was we decided to continue the space of interaction and to show how it is gone and how it's a process. So the graph are people that have not had their tags filled out yet, or have their screws and their geolocations there. It's on the graph, but we just haven't had a chance to install them or fill them out. Each one of those tags has to be completed by hand in black ink. So we've partnered with exhibits to create this process and track this process of doing community programs to talk about migrant lives lost, to talk about how policy is hostile, not the land, because Indigenous people have been living on this land since time immemorial. And so instead of doing, here in the US, we do these like classic posters, land acknowledgements. You saw one in my slide right at the very beginning. We wanted to change that here, where it wasn't, we could have just put a panel on it for 200 words or less saying that this is also Indigenous land. But instead we wanted to push back on that performativity, essentially, like those, it's a whole bunch of words and those actions, but it really doesn't have any heart in any place. And so we worked with the Autumn Collective, which is an Indigenous collective that's working the land, pushing against imperial borders and saving sacred space, to see how they wanted to define their land, how they wanted to create space. And so you see several of the artists created different pieces of installation. From here, you also have QR codes that link to videos that have folks protesting the borders, have folks protesting the hostile policies against migrant lives, against Indigenous lives. You also have spoken word videos here and people standing there. You have information about people fighting against and having to go to court. You also have smells of the land. And then they wanted to honor the lives that are lost. So you have an artist installation here. And you have plants that would be typically housed with people and funerary items with the ancestors. And they wanted that in the space to honor the lives that are also represented on the other side. So just a close-up so you can kind of see what that looks like for interactives. And then just a final closing is, these are the questions that we sit in. These are the questions that I sit in around our decolonial journey. I can also put this JPEG, if you all want it, inside of the chat. But this is where, when I think about it and things that keep me up at night, these are the questions that keep me up at night. These are the questions we ask our team. These are the questions I ask myself when I do my research. And so just wanted to offer these to you all as a space that maybe these can also help guide some of your decolonial journey within the space that you operate in. And then that's it. I may be over my time a little bit, but I hope that this is helpful. This is my contacts and my dog and his best friend, Eleanor, the chicken. But if you want to reach out, please reach out to me. And if you want to talk more or just hear more about our work, or even just thinking about like what that looks like to unpack some of the challenges you face.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Brandy. I think that really gave us so much food for thought, and you packed so many interesting aspects into this presentation, which we might perhaps slowly start to unpack just only in this Q&A or in this conversation. And I will take the freedom to ask the first question, because listening to your talk, I sense that caring for indigenous culture or with or within this culture means to learn and accept, in a way, a different kind of knowing, or perhaps to recognize, indigenous authority and autonomy, and to kind of dismantle perhaps the Euro-central or Euro-American model of institution with its underpinning, value system. Caring for those cultures perhaps means also being with those cultures and also caring for each other, which is quite interesting, because it might also offer a beautiful motto for our, contemporary conservation world as well, which is quite often, centered around the altars of large museum institutions, or suffers from exclusionary also politics. It starts to change, obviously, too. But I wonder, my question would be more about the kind of understanding of the past and the present. What kind of understanding of the past and the present is inherent in this type or in this ethics of care that you so nicely started to sketch? And not unrelatedly, perhaps what concept of time underpins care for cultural objects in which ancestry, and contemporaneity are intertwined. Perhaps that would be, kind of a starting point. I can add more to this, but I would like to hear your answer.
Question. So I hope I can answer that. So I think one of the things that we try and work with my team and our team, especially in our cultural resources, but even just in the way that we're shifting our mindsets, right, is at least traditionally within the museums in this Euro-American space, we privilege this concept of inanimacy, that it's just a bowl, right? And this bowl has to live for 1,000,000 years, right? Because our job as a museum is to conserve and protect. right? And that we take, like we love to take things, claim them as our own, and research them and become an expert on them. And we're more of an expert than the communities that they came from. So it's shifting that is really, we are the platform, we are the conduit, we are recognizing that it's not just the past and the present, it's actually the future. And that many Indigenous concepts of time and place and ways of knowing and being is that there is no line between all of those. Like for me, I am just as connected to my ancestors, and my ancestors are guiding my path forward. My ancestors guided me and wonderfully connected me to you all today. But I'm also connected to those future generations. And so it is a constant echo and a ripple. And so we are connected to those objects in that very same way. And so recognizing that all of our actions are connected is really important when we think about those cultural resources. We think about how do we handle the ancestors. When we think about stewardship. And stewardship, if you operate in the we're all connected space, in that that it is alive and that it needs seasonality is really important in many objects. That sometimes they cannot come out in a winter, or protocols in terms of, as a menstruating individual, there are items I am not allowed to be around or touch because that community says I can't be around that for my safety during that time, or that because of the gender that I cannot touch this because it would harm me, because it's only supposed to be handled by males, or only supposed to be handled by maybe an elder, right? And so that is really important, is recognizing these spaces, that they're not necessarily to push you away, but really there are protocols in place both to protect you and the items and the community. So I think that that's really important in terms of that shift and the time and like that honoring of those spaces. We also, when I think about stewardship, is holding the knowledge that if the community knows they're experts. And granted, sometimes colonialism has impacted them to where they don't have this ancestral knowledge. And that is a lot of times our doing and our connection to our doing around white supremacy. So when we think about redressing the past, we actually apologize and actively apologize. And it's not just a statement and apology, but it is a statement. It's a written apology and a verbal apology. But we also, in this apology, we come in with all of that provenance, because they should know all of the history. So for example, just if it's okay if I give an example of that, with the cultural resources of the Maya peoples, when we do a consultation with Maya peoples or other Indigenous peoples, we come in with all the provenance. We have an Excel sheet, really great Excel sheet with all of that information, but we are also bringing in and triangulating the data on how we supported the stealing of a cultural resources from their ancestral homeland. Also how it's connected to the mining industry that displaced hundreds and thousands and millions of folks, and the ways in which that person was capitalizing off and stole that item from a sacred lake, and then it was donated to us. We're connected to that legacy. We're connected to that harm. And now that piece is in diaspora, just like all of the people are in diaspora. And so what does that look like in terms of honoring those spaces? We don't always have the answer, and many times the communities are the ones that tell us what that means. And so we try not to make a lot of assumptions. And we also recognize sometimes we have a moth epidemic in the entire museum. It wreaks havoc on our textiles that we're currently stewarding. And so sometimes we have to find that middle ground between Indigenous wants and needs and practices, and also what that looks like for not just their cultural resources, but everybody's cultural resources as well. Because some of the items, they need to breathe and see the sun, and because they're alive. And if you stick them in a plastic sealed bag, they're not going to get air. But we have to find that space of compromise many times with communities, because if we don't put this textile that is alive and we honor that in a sealed plastic bag, those moths are going to reproduce, and then they're going to kill everybody's items. And so usually when we talk about it in these spaces, we're connecting with folks in that paradigm as well, to let them know that we're doing the best that we can. And we serve such a diverse group of people that we want to protect their item and serve them, but we also are connected, just like they are, to so many other communities. I don't know if that answers directly your question. But I think it's challenging, because many communities, Indigenous temporalities are different. Ancestral and rights to self-determination is different. So in the US, we have federally recognized tribes many times, and we operate within that sovereign paradigm. But Pacific Islanders are different. Maya communities in diaspora are different, right? And so one of the things I've been working with our team is many times we freeze in this fear of who is the authority, right? Are we going to talk to all, like, 2 million Indigenous folks in this space. Is that going to stop us from doing the work? Like we may not be able to talk, but we can talk to some of the diasporic communities that are in Southern California that we are connected to, because our cultural resources are in diaspora as well. So really thinking about what that looks like on how we freeze, and how colonialism continues to set barriers for us to not do the decolonial work, to reach out to communities, to help communities be connected. Like, how are we still setting up these time boundaries based upon these absolutes that we as museums need to and feel like we're supposed to have?
Wonderful. Yes, thank you very much. I can only also imagine that, within one community, that there can be also a multiplicity of voices and authorities, and perhaps, authorities in different terms, less perhaps centered or centric, as in our imagination or our image of those communities. But yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Brandy. I'm going to pass on to Emily now.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to ask you, because you emphasized the power that words have, and in a way it's also telling that your museum's name changed from Museum of Man to Museum of Us. And so in conservation, we also, because I'm a conservator, so I'm thinking a lot about the words that we use, like conservation treatment versus conservation care. And words that come up very often are the notion of loss, damage, and repair. Loss being when the damage is so extensive or the original material is gone. And then repair being what the conservator does to try to return. So I was wondering, how would you be thinking about this notion of loss and repair within your Indigenous heritage?
So I think there are spaces of repair. I think that when we think about repair, how is it generative? I think, at least from where I sit, and the work that I hope that I support, and a lot of times with cultural resources, I work towards helping in terms of like opening up the Indigenous ideologies, like ethos, like what is the practice? How are we blending the concepts you're talking about, but how are we also changing and pushing them back, right? Because is it a loss? What does that actually look like, right? Is it going back to the community? Did the spirits come and take it, right? Because like thinking about what that is. And we also we are responsible, hopefully we can get it to where it's repatriated back to them. One of the things that we've also shifted in terms of thinking about when you're talking about like repair, or I think you talked about anyways. So when we create spaces for Indigenous stewardship, and many times it's connecting plants to the ancestors, to some of the funerary items until they can go home, or that they're supposed to be in a box with a specific other item. What we've started doing is hearing how Indigenous people are referencing it and changing our language accordingly. Like it's the Indigenous medicine, right? It's medicine. It's so medicine for the ancestors, because this piece of cedar is a medicine that the ancestor needs until they're going home, because it is a part of their land. It has been doctored by the community and prayed for by the community and then sent to us. And so even just recognizing that life, that yes, they need medicines too. We also practice offerings depending on what the communities want. We do this in a space, and I think that is a space of repair. That is a space of care as well. And so repair is not always gluing a broken thumb back on, right? Repair is a lot of different things. And so if there's an example maybe that I can offer from my lived experiences, when we were doing inventory, I opened a drawer at the very bottom, tucked in the back, which was a mess because it was like Tetris in there. In the back of this drawer was an item wrapped up in a piece of fabric and plastic. I grabbed the item, brought it out, set it down, and it made me very sick. We then looked inside of looking in the archives and what that looks like. And the item was very specific. It was a ceremonial item from a different tribe that is not my own, and had some cultural protocols around it in terms of who could touch it and who could not. And all that I am should never have touched it, because it was an item that was used for a specific ceremony for men. So it did make me very sick. I happen to have contacts with people within those communities. I reached out to them, and they told me that I needed to leave an offering. I needed to do this because of the item itself is angry, and the item reacted to the fact of like the folks who are not supposed. And that's one of those things when we think about protocols, is that there are these spaces in order to care for the items and also care for us. So we found a space where we could hopefully feed this item, do the practice that the community has, which is creating this moment of repair in addition to the conserving. But I think conserving is so much more than just making sure it's not broken. Broken can be a lot of different ways for Indigenous practice. And so we left it out for a couple of hours because we didn't want all of the critters to come in for the offering we were leaving out, and the water and the dried meat, right? And so we also speak to the cultural resources. Sometimes the interns come in and they're like, who are you talking to? And so it's really changing that mindset around holding space, being in the space. Sometimes I just say it in my head. But I think that that's where I, as an Indigenous person, I think we can make sure that it doesn't fall apart, or if a basket is really fragile, that we're holding it in a way. But I think repair and care and feeding and medicine and even just interacting is so much more. And even just realizing that sometimes the resources don't need to see us. They need to see the outside. They need air circulation, but we don't need to see them. And so is it just a linen covering over the storage space so that air can still circulate, light can still get in, but that we don't have the visual directive of say a ceremonial bowl that needs to go back home, but the community is not necessarily able to take it at that time. So I think I think there can be a space. I think it's a yes, and there can be a space of traditional repair if the community wants it, if it's not super invasive, like please don't put asbestos on it. And then I think there's a space of really thinking about repair through a cultural Indigenous lens. And Indigenous is so wide because different Indigenous communities see different things in different ways.
Thank you. There are so many wonderful examples. And yeah, I think as soon as we really start reflecting on those words, of course, repair is not only gluing things back together. And I think as conservators, we really need that step back and that reminder, because we are focused on objects and also for the good. But yeah, of course, repair can also take the form of narratives or including people or changing wall labels. There are so many aspects that we could also consider care and repair. Anna, I don't know if you have more questions or if you want to open up.
You could just open up in a second, Emily. Thank you. I thought, yes, and obviously I'm also reminding everyone that you can post questions in the chat if you would like to, but you can also raise your hand just in a few minutes and we can take the questions directly. But Brandy, I was just really, really struck by all these wonderful examples that you presented us with, and also along the lines, of cultural repair and how, or cultural conservation, and how this applies to, our notions also in the conservation of contemporary art and the conservation of performance that comes from, the visual arts perspective. What does that mean? And also the idea that actually repair there is not as applicable as in the conservation of traditional objects. No, but performance from the visual arts perspective is not something that you engage with every day. As you acknowledge in your presentation. But it is an important part of human and Indigenous cultures, as you said. But there are performances of activation, or perhaps this kind of activation of certain Indigenous objects, as you already described, providing them with, with sunlight, or touching them to connect or reconnect with the ancestors, or playing them, as in this wonderful example where, the Maya musicians activated, the display of those cultural artifacts. So these are all performative acts, no? And I wonder, how do you go about those practices? Without obviously relying or falling back on this care for objects, on this kind of traditional gesture of care, keeping stuff boxed in acid-free boxes, in hygienic museum spaces. Are there any practices or any attitudes to care for those performances, for those perhaps also in intangible cultural practices that you forge in your museum or within your practice?
Yeah, and we absolutely still have acid-free boxes, y'all. And so I think that that's really is that we're not like throwing acid-free boxes away for a cardboard box or something, but we still have these museum spaces, and we still are also, you know, looking at what that looks like for the integration of Indigenous ideology, for the humility in the space of we're not the experts, and then also thinking about this, right? So I think when I think about a lot of Indigenous performances, I think about music, and when I believe maybe I talked to Emily about it a while ago, was a lot of the songs, language, some of that has been recorded by museums, and some museums are grappling with this archival information of songs and stories that have been stolen from the community, because people would go into these tribal settings, these meetings, these ceremonial spaces with like hidden recorders, and then they would bring that into the archival spaces. And so right now it's looking, how do we repatriate that back, right? How do we also redress that colonial harm of invasiveness? And then also honor that the communities, that this may have been lost, but why has it been lost? So not to be like you wouldn't have had it without us, but it's lost because of colonialism. We want to recognize that because of all of the policies, and that we snuck in because of these concepts of the disappearing Indian. They're vanishing from the earth, and so we were collecting every bits and pieces of you. Now what we see in contemporary art is many times like, and it's part of the traditional pathways, is dances and songs and there's dialects as well of these different songs, but they are attached to clans, they are attached to families, they're attached to a specific dancer, and there's these rites of using them. They're both orally iterated, and so people, if you go into a dance setting, or if we, let's say, had a powwow or a celebration, each of these dancers, they have rights to either they've made their own or they've been passed down from a different space, or a drum who is playing a song. Those songs belong to different communities. And if you're playing one that's not your drums, you need to have the right and the agreement from that group to play that song, because it's not your ownership. And that's the oral lineage, because people will come up and say, do you have the right to sing this song from this group? And so how do we track that? So thinking about in terms of what that looks like as a museum, if we're recording it, it's essentially consent, right? And making sure that we are recognizing that we have consent in terms of tracking it, if we're going to record it, if we're going to grade it into archives, and also recognizing that some things just don't need to be tracked in that way, right? Maybe it is something that we pass down orally, similar to how they've passed down within our space, but writing that in our practices in terms of making sure that we're not always everywhere with our paper and pen, trying to scribble everything down and talk about that someone is wearing a blue shirt and they stood facing east. Their cultural practices is maybe that they don't want it to be written down because of the evolution, because culture is not static. And I think that integration is really important. I do think that we have a space to conserve. I do think that we have a space to protect, but we should conserve and protect what communities want us to conserve and protect, not what we necessarily like define, because it's their community. We've stolen so much from them and from us, from Indigenous people, that this is our space. And again, I keep saying humble, but this is our space to humble ourselves, to like rebuild trust. And rebuilding trust many times is taking a step back and saying, what do you want? And how do you want it? And many times, I know that it sounds scary to say we're not going to do it, but a lot of folks want you to do it. And so even just asking what they want and how they want it, and sometimes they're like, I don't know, what do you all think? And I think that's really important. The other thing I would mention too in consultations that I think is really important for us is, for example, if they're like folks are picking up the ocarina and playing and they're in a room, we're asking them if we as museum people should be there, because sometimes this should just be a Maya space. And if they want us to leave, then that is also fine. And so we want to make sure that we're creating that space of trust, that they don't have to be under the guise of authority, because this is these are their belongings, their cultural heritage. So I don't think it directly answers your question, but I think it's really us trying to create a space to where they will want us to then they would trust us to be able to have it in there. And then if we have these intangible pieces that are recording in a tangible form, that we are looking to repatriate them back, or if they want them online, or there's this really great platform called Mukadu, that is a collections-based platform that is driven by Indigenous peoples, and they get to decide what they want on display, how they want it on display, the labels that their resources are, be it intangible, tangible, culturally protected, and then there's these barriers set up too. So I think we're seeing the wave of like how archival work, how collections, cultural resources departments, how our collection management spaces are starting to shift to make sure that we're honoring Indigenous ideologies and practices too.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful, Brandy. That's really a lot of food for thought. I thought that I would pass on to Emily, but she tells me, let's open up, let's share the space, let's share the space with others and take a few questions from the audience. So you can both, we see already some hands raised. You can both type in, right, your questions to the chat, as we mentioned before, or just just ask your questions directly. And I'm seeing that Frankie Moore was, I think, the first attendee who raised the question, and we see Alexandra Alberta. So perhaps I will just pass on to Frankie Moore, and they will ask the first question. Frankie, feel free to unmute yourself, and yes.
Hi, waving hi from the UK and Wales right now, Cardiff Uni. I had a question, and you can tell by my accent I'm an American as well. I had a question for how do you initiate first contact when it comes to repatriation for non-federally recognized nations, as well as what happens when you try to initiate repatriation and you find out the tribe is, or First Nation is either no longer, like what happens if they're not around still? Like how do you work with like those remains or objects, knowing that the people that did make those objects are gone?
Yeah, so maybe I'll give a brief overview on federally recognized in the U.S. Borders. Federally recognized means that you have the U.S. government recognize you as an Indigenous tribe. My tribes are federally recognized. There's over 200 tribes, and there's various pieces of like check boxes that you have to achieve in order to get federal recognition, and there's different treaty rights. Then there's state recognized tribes, and there are state recognized tribes that are also federally recognized, but then there are also state recognized tribes that are not state recognized or are not federally recognized. And then there's another subgroup of communities and tribal communities that are neither state nor federally recognized, that they are there. They're Indigenous, but they're not recognized by the government. They don't get land. They don't have any treaty rights. They aren't covered by some of the policies that the U.S. government has around NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection Repatriation Act. That only applies to federally recognized tribes, just in terms of the baseline. Our colonial pathways policy was developed because we saw the gaps in NAGPRA, and we saw that instead of having NAGPRA as the ceiling, that NAGPRA should be the floor that we build onto, because why are we catering to these like colonial gaps at a privileged institution? So when we think about that colonial pathways, and we think about non-recognized tribes in terms of those spaces, we're looking at it similar to, we're looking at UNDRIP, we're looking at the similarities around other Indigenous communities outside of the US colonial imperial borders, because even the Indigenous people of Guam, not recognized by the federal government and not covered by NAGPRA. So when we think about it, it's like, what are the organization structures of communities? I think, so we have these non-tribal, sometimes they have governance systems. And so we're looking at rights to self-determination. How do we work within those governance systems? If they don't have a governance systems, then we're looking at what is the collective space? Are they in our area? Where are they in us? And then how do we come together to look at what repatriation looks like? Similar to how we're working with the Maya communities, right? So right now we have 5 Maya consultants. Granted, those Maya peoples don't cover the vastness of Maya peoples. They do cover some Maya peoples in Southern California and some international Maya peoples who are in diaspora. And so honoring that space of what does repatriation look like? Should we repatriate to communities in diaspora because the cultural resources in diaspora? Grappling with some of those pieces in terms of what does it look like to send all of the items back home when the communities are also here? What do they want the communities here? So it is not a one size fits all model. It depends on each community. Right now, in terms of reaching out, we have a lot of cultural resources that need to go home. And we also have federal mandates for NAGPRA. So we're operating in a space where we have a waiting list of folks based upon our very small capacity of 2-3 people. So hopefully we've got folks that are in pause that are asking for repatriation. We haven't gotten to a space where we are actually reaching out to folks to repatriate because people know our policies and are reaching out to us. So we're working through a lot of those requests at the moment, and then also consultations for requests. So maybe we're not repatriating and they're not ready to be repatriated, but they want to come in and visit their ancestors and pray over their ancestors. So sometimes there's a lot of different ways, and anyone can do that. Like if I wanted to come and visit my ancestor and pray over, because we have lots of my ancestors, then I can go in and leave an offering and pray with them, or just sit with them and talk to them, if that's what I want to do. So there's these different types of access points instead of you either just get everything back or you don't get access. If I think that and I think that was your question, right? Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Can we maybe take a question from the chat, because it's also about repatriation. Maybe I can just read it briefly. With the museum's managing board main responsibility being the continuation of the institution, expanding more visitor, more exhibition, etc. How does one convince the board that we can repatriate everything?
Yeah, so our board development has been a really long process. And so many times what we had noticed, the board started to grow. A lot of the board members were not in this. They were like, why would you even want to do this? And so what I would say, if your museum's board is very much focused on the continuation of the institution, like what does it look like for more visitors, revenue building, like we need to be here, sustainable. What we did was we created a Decolonizing Initiatives working group. And this working group was not just staff that really care about it, but it was staff and board. And it was really intentionally structured. And so one of the spaces that we had different staff members from collections, cultural resources, right? My team, and then other different like education team. And then we also had some of the executive management team in there. And then we had board members. And we asked the board members, and different board members elected in. So they were decided by the big board to come and be a part of this development process. So they already had the trust built in by the primary, 20 deep board. And we have 5 people. In these meetings, they didn't happen quick. We were very intentional. We started to bear our coloniality, essentially. We started to revisit the provenance. And it wasn't just saying this was donated by Jim Smith, but we were tracking the history. What is that? How was it donated? How did they know that they got it? We have pieces of items where we were pulling pieces and showing that this item was actually, we were used as a pawn shop. And then we have information from the collections department that said that the Indigenous person was crying when they gave it to us, but they were hungry, and but it was ceremonial. They asked for their name not to be on it, but they needed money to feed their kids because they were starving. And they wanted 100, but we knew they were starving, so we would give them $50 for it. That's terrible, right? And so we're bringing these examples, all of those colonial pathways, into that space, triangulating the data points, and then we're unpacking it together. We're talking about how we have replicated colonial harm, how archaeologists have. And then what does that look like for us to address it? So we're really laying the foundation and intentionally moving through, and then how do we build together? We're unpacking a lot of white supremacy at the same time. So it doesn't happen in 2 meetings. It happened over the course of the year. When we get to convincing the board to repatriate everything, we're building the policy collectively. Someone is writing a draft, but we're going paragraph by paragraph with the 12 person working group and saying, how do you feel about this? Are these words right? What do we think? Why aren't you comfortable with this? And we're constantly working through that. Also a very long, arduous process. But by the time it gets done, you have a collective decolonizing working group ownership where the board and the staff are agreed on and have come to the space and have collective ownership. And we've built trust over that time. And built pausing in over that time. So then by the time we get it to the board to approve something so massive like the Colonial Pathways Repatriation practice, they already trust the board. So it's not just Brandy, who's like this native person who's really passionate about it, going to the board because, she's going to want, right, all of these things because this is what she thinks of these wild ideas. But it's me and 2 different board members, and the board members are presenting this because they have collective ownership, and then I'm coming in and supporting what they're saying. So I'm able to leverage their power and whiteness in order to also support it through an Indigenous ideology, through a decolonial ideology. And they trust, because of all of that, the process didn't happen overnight. They know that we're approaching it intentionally. Again, it's not easy. I think a lot of it falls on the shoulders of our BIPOC, Black, Indigenous communities of color workers, because we're having to relive lived experiences. I'm having to relive the trauma and colonial harm of all of this, and that some of our board members historically, stole ancestors from their final grave and brought them to the museum. And I'm having to meet them where they are and teach them that their professional career has been built on colonialism. So I say this in terms of it is possible. It is not always easy, but each point is really intentional. And leaving out that provenance piece is not an option, because it's so essential. And what I've realized is, even when we start new decolonizing working group projects, we need to talk about our colonial legacy, that transparency and truth-telling. When I do an orientation with new staff, new board, I'm always starting with, this is our legacy. These are the harms we've perpetrated. This is why. And so it's why we do what we do. I hope that that answers your question to some degree, and like how that transition, it's slow, it's difficult, but that's the way that we did it anyways.
Wonderful. Thank you, Brandy. That was the question by Anastasios Velios. So if Anastasios has a follow-up, do this. And now I see Alexandra Alberda already turn on her screen and is going to ask. Next question. Over to you, Alexandra.
And actually, the end of your answer there led nicely into the question I'm going to ask. So I'm the curator of Indigenous Perspectives at Manchester Museum in the UK. And it was so wonderful to see your presentation, because I feel like we have a lot of similar thoughts, but you're much further along. So I will definitely follow up. But I wondered, because you started talking about that space and the recording and revealing the colonial history. And I wanted to go to how you guys have maybe grappled with the archives, because what I'm finding here, because there isn't that distance to Indigenous communities here in the UK the same way as there is in other places, that the historical tags associated, or the archival kind of folders, like we have a really terrible, cringy education folder from like the 70s that I found. And so, I should say, I'm part Jemez Pueblo, so there's a part of me that's like, destroy it, I'm going to burn everything with fire. But what is that balance of, and how do you, especially in the archives where you might introduce researchers, and not just Indigenous researchers that might get traumatized by what they find, but also how do you name or change labels and retain these types of historical artifacts so that anyone encountering them, whether they're researchers, community members, or staff members, I don't know if it's a statement that addresses like, by the way, these are all terrible, please don't reiterate any of these, but how do you create these, how do you hold on to things so you don't erase your past to make yourself look good when, like you say, when we go off to do our kind of individual, like when I go back, make plates with sauce holders in them and stop being here, that kind of retains within the space, but also then takes those really toxic labels out of the vicinity of these ancestors and that are not always, biological material, but takes that toxic disconnect that is creating that kind of spiritual layer. And so now I'm starting to waffle, but how do you do that?
Yeah, so we don't get rid of things, right? Because that is a part of truth-telling and accountability. We are not, something that we've really pushed for with my department is that the decolonizing is not a practice of being like, look how amazing we are, like we're so great now, let's move them forward, right? And I'm sorry, my chickens just laid an egg again, so you may hear them squawking in the background, so I'm sorry. There's 4 of them. So what we do, and if we think about it just in our cultural resources space, in our collection space, and the archives and our management platform, when we're going through this and we're working with Indigenous communities, or we're just working with our interns, or we're working with our staff, we're looking at the description. And what we do is if we're changing the names, we're dating this, that this was here, then we're changing it and saying, this is actually not what it is. This was colonial. It has been changed on this date because it was the colonial for these reasons. And then we're giving a different description. And so we're also adding, because search words are really important. And so we can have new search words that, like for my example, my tribe, it's Chickasaw and Choctaw, right? If we're using our indigenous words, but it's Chickasaw and Choctaw if we're using the English words that were been labeled on us because I couldn't pronounce our words. So if we're going to then shift it and honor the autonomy of indigenous people, just like Dene and Navajo, right? We want both of those search words in here. Even if one of those search words are racist and like highly colonial, that those are part of the words that can be searched, because many times we get a list from communities and they include those because they know that museums across the board have it. That doesn't mean it's the primary word that shows up, but it is in the words that are able to be searched to be able to locate items. And so we also, when we're talking about our consultation process and how do we not want to perpetrate harm, but we want to be honest, we're very honest at the beginning that this is what we have done. The paperwork and what you'll find in here may have and probably has really hurtful pieces that could be triggering, that may bring up a lot of harm and pain. And if you want to take a pause afterwards, we'll do it. If you want us to leave the room, that's fine. Sometimes people get mad and they yell at us and we say yes, right? They're not mad at me and I didn't do it, but I'm a representation of the museum, and I'm a representation of redressing the harm. And so really recognizing that space and as a person, compartmentalizing is, this is my job that I'm here to do, and I'm here to do this. That as Brandy, they're not mad at Brandy, right? They're mad at the person, that the museum of us, the museum of man, right? And so I think that that's really important, and the tracking of that information. When I think about what that looks like for the larger scope, in terms of exhibits, I got a tangible example, but I'm so excited to my exhibit, because we showed this provenance and what does it look like in terms of on display. We have their exhibit, because they wrote the script for their exhibit and I just did a little bit of editing. They decided what's inside of the exhibit. It is a Maya told exhibit, and they wanted the diversity of Maya peoples and a celebration. They also were like, you need to tell the truth. And I was like, yes, we do need to tell the truth. And so with that, there is a whole section about the truth of colonialism. We have panels that define what is colonialism, panels that define colonial pathways, and we have those pieces, those cultural resources that are then connected to that colonial provenance. And then we have a whole exhibit piece that is connected to items that we don't have any provenance, and it's asking the question, now that you know how these got here and how the connection to colonialism, the process of diaspora, mining, fruit farms, right, the missionaries, what about these? And what does that look like as a museum person? What does that look like for decolonizing when we know nothing about the provenance? And so it's asking people, it's being honest, and also having other people, well, how does this make you feel? What does that look like? This is also part of us because we don't have any of that information. Sometimes our fault, sometimes the collector's fault. So finding ways both in the external and in the internal to make sure that we are being transparent around our practices.
Thanks so much, Brandy. And thanks, Alexandra, for asking this very interesting questions. Rosie Cook is now, I think, online. Over to you.
Hi, and thank you, Brandy. That was an amazing presentation, and your questions have been really helpful as well. I mean, the answers to the questions. So I've recently moved to Europe after working in Asia Pacific and Australia for many years, and it's been a really, I guess, a positive experience to meet many people in museum spaces here who are really interested in integrating decolonial practices and including that in conservation practice and not just curatorial or other areas. But one major issue I'm noticing here compared to in Asia Pacific is that the geographical barriers and how to manage the fact that on one hand, so many of the staff are European themselves, and they're having to make decisions about who they're going to reach out to, who they will do projects with, basically still unconsciously or consciously perpetuating the power imbalances. And even if there's some consciousness of these structural issues, where even to start changing. And then on the other hand, with the desire to indigenize practices, But again, that cultural barrier, that geographical barrier, and I've seen a lot of anxiety around almost self-imposed language and cultural barriers, which I feel is probably partly through lack of exposure, and it's not unfounded, but yeah, it's complicated, I think, compared to working directly in locations of, I say past and present colony, basically colonization. So what are if you had any thoughts on this European context?
Yeah, I think when we look at, or at least for me, what I feel like is looking at, I think indigenization is incredibly important, right? When we talked about like some of the practices, the integration, the change in culture, the change in the ethos and how we approach resources and ancestors. There are also other aspects of decolonization. There are redressing colonial harm. It's honesty and truth-telling and recognition of the harm that you have perpetrated, that you continue, and that you're probably still continuing and will in the future. And like, what does that look like to redress that harm? And I mean, that's really important. Granted, we are on Kumeyaay land. We're in the middle of the US, right? There's indigenous peoples. There's indigenous people everywhere. There's also thinking about the impacts that Europe has had on indigenous peoples, on Black peoples, on communities of color, because decolonization practices also apply to the colonial harm that's happened to Black peoples, peoples of color, also indigenous peoples. And so thinking about what that looks like to redress it, what does it look like to be truth-telling? What does it look like to be accountable? What are those actions taking place? How do our best practices perpetrate those harms? And then start addressing that, right? Even in the language, right? And so I think we have a predominantly white staff. We're doing the work, but we still are very deep in the typical percentages of our executive management teams, majority whites. Like, I'm the only indigenous person on staff at the moment. And so really thinking about what does that look like in terms of for our European descendant white staff to be reflective of the space that they're holding and the power dynamics, and then pausing to think about how can we create spaces that privilege these communities? How do we create advisory councils, and in those commitments, those advisory. And so I say that because I think, like, we have resources from all over the world. So I'm not directly connected to the indigenous people in the Philippines or the Maori, right? Like, I'm not in their backyard. And yet we can have an advisory space with those folks there. And yet we also shouldn't be privileging our besties, right? Because, you know, my cousin knows a Maori person who knows another person, and we're going to have all of our friends who were sort of speaking in a silo. And so thinking about ways that we can outreach to communities and get connected. Maybe we're posting and asking if anyone wants to be a part of the advisory council. Like, what are we looking in terms of reaching out to other spaces that are not also colonial entities and have like cherry picked people that will say yes. And sometimes that's fine, but sometimes, the majority of the time, that's like, we want a diverse advisory council because we really want to create a space to where it's not just all professors at a university, but it's also community artists, it's young people, right? Because what are the young people saying? What do they want? And I think that that's really important too when we think about that changing of the dynamics. So that's maybe where I would suggest both the language shift is important, because that's what we did. We had the power to do that because everyone was like, no, you can't do it. So we were like, you change culture by changing language, and then you start integrating pieces of practices and then they catch on, right? And then you can start working on policy many times. But thinking about what does decolonization look like? And if indigenization is not the first pathway, there's other pathways to decolonization that then you can bring in indigenous peoples, Black peoples, communities of color. Yeah, but reach out if you want to unpack any of it. I'd love to talk about it.
I'm realizing the time's almost up. It's just, yeah, the difficulty of being someone at the top has to make the decision to reach out and who we decide to reach out to. And it's really difficult balancing like a self-awareness with, we just need to get started. We need to do something, start talking to people. So yeah, that's why it's really interesting to hear your perspectives. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And let's pass on to Frankie Moore. Do you have another question, Frankie?
Yeah, thank you so much, by the way. I forgot to thank you, but this has been a really enlightening conversation, especially with the UK school system. We haven't had as many conversations as we should about thinking about repatriation, and this has been really enlightening in terms of thinking how this can be broadly applied to like conservative practices. I had a question about on your cultural resource collection steward slide. You mentioned the Indigenous ownership of intangible cultural heritage. And I was wondering, from a conservator's perspective, how can you conserve that? And if you shouldn't, and you should like repatriate it, how does repatriation work for intangible heritage? That makes sense.
Yeah, so it depends on what kind of intangible heritage, right? And I think that depends on how it's repatriated and how is it tracked in your archives. So if they're vocal recordings, if it's data that you've tracked around processes, around the ceremonies that you've observed, like those pieces. If I think about the ways that we've recorded and the images that we've recorded, so I think it depends on what it is and how you, and then giving it back if they want it back and saying that you have it, right? So I think if you have intangible heritage within your collection space and you're working with communities, it's not just showing all of the pots and the bowls and the textiles when you're talking about these consultations. It's also saying, we also have all of this. We also have all of these publications and all of this like copyright material and all of these journals and these recordings and these videos. And so this is what our archives say. So having that Excel sheet with everything on it, both the dates, the provenance, all of that is important. Those stories, we're not deleting the fact that our curators said that an Indigenous person is a liar and there's no possible way that this was used 100 years ago. That's in there because communities need to see that. We need to be honest about that. And so I think it's whatever you have, you need to offer it up. And that's at least our space. That hasn't always been our space about 7 years ago, but that is a space that we collectively decided, especially when thinking about repatriation being like, how do we make sure that we're ethically repatriating, not to just some people, but to all folks. Not everybody wants everything back. And I keep saying that, but it's really true. That's my answer is if you have intangible, you offer it and say, how do they want it? And so, because they don't know what you have if you're not going to be transparent about what you have. I also just thinking about Rosie, like if the folks at the top are the ones that are making the decisions about reaching out, I think that does set a barrier, right? And I want to honor that because I get told no a lot. And I can only imagine how much you get told no at a different like space or like all the rest of the folks. So we get told no, even though we're like, but we know that this will be good. This is what the communities have asked. And so sometimes you have to operate in the no. Sometimes you got to go rogue and hope for the best. That's what I've done that too, and apologize later and be like, I don't know. And that's probably not the best advice for you. I'm sorry. The other thing that I would also offer, and I'm sorry, time is short, but one of the things that I think about when I work this and when I cry at home because I feel so defeated because it's just a wall of no's from my executive management team or a wall of no's from the board or like we're reliving 5 years ago where they're terrified of repatriation. And I'm like, but we have a policy. Is sitting and reminding myself like that I think about decolonization and the practice of water. I think about it in relationship to water. I think about our work in relationship to water. And when I think about it, it's an action, it's malleable, it's flexible, it's movable. And a drop of water hitting over and over and over again will eventually create a divot. It's going to create a hole, will create a passageway. If we're working together, and if you're leveraging my successes, leveraging other people's work, leveraging the power of Indigenous communities, that's why I'm here right now, is because Indigenous people fought for my position for like decades. We can move mountains, we can carve an entire river and valley within a space and change the ecology of the museum field. And I know that may sound like utopian and all these spaces, and I don't know if I would have believed it 12 years ago when I was sitting and having coffee with my supervisor and they're like, what if it was different? But it's starting to be different. And so I'm seeing the collective power. We're talking about it now, right? And so thinking about, when I think about is, where are those drops of passageways? Like, where can we start working to start digging a passageway? And maybe it's not with an advisory council right now. Maybe it's shifting language. Maybe it's me just treating the cultural resources a little bit different. Maybe it's consultations being different, right? Maybe it's creating curriculum and being honest about the curriculum harming and then moving forward in terms of creating curriculum with community that's community led and asking them what they want, or programs asking them what they want. And those, you start to see the success and you can leverage that data, at least from where I said I've leveraged that data to be like, yo, look at this. What do you think now? Because people used to be real mad. They would like, we can't say violent assimilation. You can't say genocide. That's scary. No. And so I was like, okay. So we worked through and I'm like, how about forced assimilation? And they were like, okay, we feel good about that. Well, I was able to use forced, and then they get acclimated. And now we're saying violent. A year later, now we're saying violent genocide, violent assimilation. And so, yeah, I had to take a pause and like not do what I wanted, but I worked to get something in the middle that they were comfortable with that still was truthful, to be able to kind of inch forward. So I don't always get a 10, maybe I get a 2, maybe I get a 5, but that can actually then scoot forward. So I'm bending and not breaking. And so I hope that that's also helpful, because I do think I hear what you're saying, and it's hard.
Well, thank you so much. And yeah, I liked particularly what you said about maybe you make a curriculum and then recognize that it's harmful, because in conservation, we have a great fear about, do no harm. And do I not intervene? Like, is it better not to have an intervention rather than risk damaging it further or doing the wrong thing? And sometimes it's a hard decision to make, but you have to look at the context of who's being harmed beyond our own personal ambitions.
One real quick, and I know that we're at time, but I'm going to put a link, is the recognition of harm that I did in a Google Arts and Culture exhibit that we did. I'll put the link in there. It's Colonial Legacy. It talks about the facade, but we have specific statements. Granted, they are a massive statement compared to where we would have been maybe 2 years ago. And I was able to do it in the pandemic where I heard less no's, but it may be something in terms of thinking about ways to build a curriculum, build reflection in an online platform too.
Mm-hmm. That's fantastic, Brandy, and thank you so much for your absolutely inspirational talk and answers. Thanks, everyone, for fantastic interventions. I just want to take 1 more minute to, reiterate the thanks to everyone, to our speaker, to my colleague, Emily Magnon, for the co-organization of the event, obviously, and as well to our entire team. Thank you to the audiences for the excellent questions. If you, as we mentioned before, we will basically have a recording of this event put up on our website, which I very briefly share with everyone, just for your information. Performance, conservation, materiality, knowledge, right? So do check this space. Then also, I would also like to take this opportunity before we part to just remind us of the terrible war happening in Ukraine, in Europe, right, as an effect of brutal invasion of Putin, Russia, and the dramatic consequence of this war, due to which people, our colleagues, friends, artists, and scholars are deprived of living conditions and perspectives for the future. So please consider supporting them through organizations, perhaps such as, Scholars at Risk or Artists at Risk. And yes, thank you so much again. Bravo to Brandy, and see you very soon in this space or another space in a very close future.